Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. For you locals, you might not think I look much like Doug Wagner, and I am not. Our local WMT host, Doug Wagner, was supposed to be joining us today, but he has been called out of town. My name is Lisa Wiebinga, and I am a volunteer with Monarch Research, and I'm helping today in this very special webinar, and I am going to give you a few of our ground rules, and then I'll turn it over to our founder, Clark McLeod. First of all, we're very happy to have you here. We are recording this webinar, so you can come back and review at a later date. We'll have it posted out on our website, monarchresearch.org. We will be taking your questions. At any time, you can put those into the Q&A forum. There's a little button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Go ahead and post those in. And after Dr. Tallamy's presentation, he's happy to answer as many questions as possible. Right now, everyone is on mute. We would love for you to ask those questions in the Q&A, but if you have some pressing matter that you need to be unmuted for, go ahead and raise your hand or request that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Clark McLeod.
Thank you, Lisa. This is very exciting to have Dr. Tallamy back again. He was here in October and wowed us all. And so we asked him at that time to do something special for the people in our audience. We told them it was a surprise. And the surprise is Dr. Tallamy is back in the middle of winter. So what's our objective today? It's really to talk more about the oak trees that Dr. Tallamy talked about this last session, and really how Dr. Tallamy has handled his own property, planting oak trees from acorns. And he's our expert on that. And he says it's easy, just go out and do it. Well, you know, everyone says that. So Mary and I diligently, after the webinar or the session last October, went out and collected 4,555 acorns. Those are the ones that tested to, positive for being able to plant and germinate. So we have those, and those are going to be available for pickup immediately following the webinar. And we'd like 4,555 seedlings growing this spring. So when you go to our partner sites, Indian Creek Nature Center, WikiUp, and Monarch Research, you ask for the number of acorns you would like to have. Depending on the demand, you may be restricted initially, but you can come back and probably get some more acorns. We want them all planted. Imagine, you know, what can happen out of a webinar like this. We do all of our stuff with partners and groups of people. So just take the group of people on this webinar with 4,555 acorns. Imagine what we can do in the spring with those. Very exciting, and Dr. Tallamy is going to help us. Doug is so famous now, it's hard to actually get him in any 1 month period of time. He's so booked. He's the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He's published 211 research publications, and he's taught for 41 years. Did I miss
111? 111.
How many did I say? 1,000?
You said 211.
Oh, 111. I'm sorry.
Close enough.
Okay, so he's published books, and Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, Nature's Best Hope, New York Times bestseller, The Nature of Oaks, winner of the American Horticulture Society Award in 2022. So with that said, Dr. Tallamy, teach us how we can take and transform an acorn into an oak tree.
All right. Thank you very much, Clark. That is exactly what I want to focus on today. We'll talk a little bit about how wonderful oaks are, but you had your terrible derecho. You lost a lot of trees. And even if you hadn't lost a lot of trees, we need to increase the percentage of oaks that are in our landscapes because they are such important plants. Before we talk about that, let me talk about one of the most important things that oaks do. E.O. Wilson, way back in 1987, told us that insects are the little things that run the world. And he told us why that was. We haven't listened to him. As a matter of fact, we have killed more than 45% of the Earth's insects. So that's not good. And we've killed them, of course, because we construct our environments filled with lights, and lights kill insects. Neonicotinoids kill insects, and all the light green areas are places where we use a lot of neonicotinoids. Deforestation kills insects, cars kill insects, climate change kills insects. When you take an area like this and you turn it into that, it kills insects. So what does any of that have to do with oaks? Well, there's no better way to share our spaces with insects than to plant an oak. So when you plant an oak, you're actually well on your way to saving life on planet Earth. Sounds dramatic, but it's true. Why is that? Well, oaks have superior ecological function. They have the highest biodiversity value, meaning they support more species. Let's just talk about North America, more species in North America than any other type of tree. They're sequestering more carbon dioxide than almost all types of trees because they're long-lived, they're very dense tissues, and they become huge. They're the best soil stabilizers because they have very large root systems. They make the best leaf litter, meaning that it lasts up to 3 years. A single leaf takes 3 years to break down. So it's doing its job as a blanket on the soil community, better than other types of leaves. All of that promotes healthier watersheds. And these are wonderful things that a single tree is doing 24/7. But when I suggest people go out and plant oaks, the comment I get typically is that they're too expensive. And we don't have the money to plant an oak. So is that true? Well, it can be true if you insist on planting a large oak. Now, nurserymen have figured out that we want instant gratification. We want the tree to be its full size immediately. So they figured out how to grow oaks in pots to quite a big size without them becoming root bound. Now, in the old days, you couldn't do that because the trees would be root bound, and you plant them and they die in short order. But now they have something called air pots. They can plant those, or can grow those trees to a pretty good size. They're not root bound. But look at the size of the tree and the size of the pot. The amount of root system that's associated with that tree isn't nearly enough to support growth on that tree. So as soon as you plant it, it's got to rebuild its root system. And that can take a long time. That can take up to 10 years. The other option, of course, is to have a bald and burlap tree where you actually chop off the roots, dig it up out of the ground, chop off the roots, wrap it in burlap, and then you plant that. So if it doesn't die, it again takes a long time to rebuild its root systems. The point I want to make today, though, is if I plant an acorn, the same time we plant these big trees, which are quite expensive, that acorn after 10 years will produce a tree which is bigger and a lot more healthier than the trees we just spent a lot of money on. And of course, the acorn is free. So acorns are the key, but it does take a little bit of patience because they start out small. So let's talk about how to do this. When should you look for acorns? You know, acorns fall in the fall, you know that. But a lot of people wait several weeks before they go to collect their acorns. You want to collect acorns for planting as soon as they fall, because you're not the only one collecting them. There's a lot of other animals that depend on acorns. And just a few days, well, maybe, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 days after the acorns fall, there's very few under the tree because so many things have carried them away. And what they do is they carry away the best acorns and leave the ones that aren't so good. And if you go and collect late, you'll only get poor acorns. There are two major oak groups in Iowa anyway, the white oak group and the red oak group. The white oak group germinates in the fall. So it's too late to collect those acorns. They would have germinated way back in late September and early October. We can think about those next year, but we're going to focus on the red oak group, and that would be pin oaks, scarlet oaks, black oaks, northern red oaks, shingle oaks. There are many species in the red oak group. Those acorns germinate in the spring. So the acorns that Clark talked about are the northern red oak, Quercus rubra, and those are the ones that are going to be available for you to plant. How do you recognize red oak, any member of the red oak group from the white oak group? It's really the lobes of the leaves. There's a lot of variation in oak leaves, but the white oak group has rounded lobes. This is a white oak leaf here, another white oak leaf here. And the red oak group has pointed lobes. So when the leaf has a pointed lobe, like up here, over here, it is a member of the red oak group, and those acorns will germinate in the spring. This is what an acorn looks like. Red oak, what you can't appreciate here is the size difference. The red oak acorn is one of our larger acorns, pretty good size. Pin oak is quite a bit smaller. So you can verify which tree you have by the size of the acorn in many cases. And this is what it looks like. You walk up to a tree. I think I took this picture right outside of the Monarch Research Station, as a matter of fact. Some of these might be the acorns that you're going to go pick up. Those are all red oak acorns. So how do we test for acorn viability? Now, Clark's already done this for you, but for future years, this is what you do. You just float them. Put them in water. Doesn't have to be a wine glass unless you want to take a pretty picture. When they're viable, they sink. So you're guaranteed to have viable acorns when they sink. When they're not viable, and I can't guarantee that this is 100%, but they will float. So because we have so many acorns, just take the sinkers and then you're sure of viability. You can do that with pin oaks, pin acorns as well. Now you have two options. You can plant your acorn immediately, right after you figure out which one's viable, right into the soil where you want your tree to be, or you can hold your acorn over the winter and plant it in the spring. Now, when Cindy and I moved into our house in Oxford, Pennsylvania, it was a farm that was mowed for hay. There was very little life here. We found acorns down the street. We planted them immediately, and we had tremendous success. If I were to do that today, I would have almost complete failure. So what's the difference? The difference is that when we planted our acorns, originally, we had almost no life at our house. There were no mice, there were no deer, there were no squirrels, especially. So when we put those acorns in the ground, they stayed there, they germinated, and everything was great. Well, today our property houses so many creatures that those acorns are eaten right away, particularly squirrels. They love those acorns. You have to deal with that if you're going to plant right away. You know that there are things that want to eat those acorns, and we'll talk about how to do that in a minute. If you decide to hold the acorns for the spring, you are going to keep them in the winter, or put them in the refrigerator over the winter time. I like to put them in peat moss because that's acidic and it keeps fungus from attacking those. And what you're doing is you're giving them a period of dormancy. Now, normally they'd be outside overwintering, but again, if they're outside, they're exposed to all those things that want to eat those acorns. So put them in a Ziploc bag with some peat moss, damp peat moss, zip it up, put them in the fridge, and they can sit there for several months. They should sit there for several months because that will break the dormancy right there in the refrigerator. You know what? I'm missing several slides here. Oh, well, we will proceed. There's another thing that you have to deal with, and that is acorn weevils. Acorn weevils are very common in acorns. This is what an adult acorn weevil looks like. This is what a larval acorn weevil looks like. It's tunneling out of the acorn, and they can be really common in acorns. And of course, once it's out of the acorn, it leaves a hole in the acorn, and it has eaten part of the endosperm of the acorn. And acorns are pretty good at germinating, even if they have had one acorn weevil in them. But if they have two, they probably won't germinate. So it's best to only use acorns that do not have acorn weevils in them. So after you have them in the refrigerator over the winter, look for holes in your acorns. If you have holes, it means an acorn weevil has exited. You might say, why aren't they in my plastic bag? Well, they'll chew right through your plastic bag and try to get into the ground, so you might not find the weevil itself. but only use the acorns that don't have acorn weevils. So you're going to look for emergence holes just like this and plant the ones without emergence holes. Okay, 2 more choices. You can, now we've made it to the springtime. You can plant directly into the soil, or you can plant into a flower pot. So if you plant directly into the soil, you're going to have to protect it from all those creatures we talked about. This is a cage that I fashioned. Clark can show you a cage that he fashioned in a few minutes. You're trying to keep those, particularly the rodents, out of your little space here so that your acorn can germinate. So there's nothing special about this. You just have to make the mesh small enough that particularly mice cannot get through it. And if you don't do that, chances are good your acorn's going to be eaten. If you decide to put it in a flower pot, and it could be easier to protect your acorn from the things that want to eat it if you do put it into a flower pot. You want to choose a pot that is at least 8 inches deep. The first thing the acorn is going to do is to sink a root, which it can be pretty long. You don't want that root to go around and around and around the pot. That's what creates the root bound situation. And if you plant a tree that is root bound, it will continue to grow. The roots will continue to grow in a circle and eventually strangle themselves, and the tree will die. So you want to pick a deep pot. Soil, you've got 2 options again. You can take the soil right from the area where you're going to plant the acorn. And that's what I like to do, because then the acorn doesn't have to adjust to a new soil type. Or you can go to the store and get potting soil. Potting soil is nice and light and fluffy, and it's dark and it looks nice. It's more for pleasing us than it is for pleasing the acorn. Now we have to position the acorns in the right way. When acorns fall, typically they land on their side, just like this. So the easiest thing is to plant them on their side. That's gonna mimic what happens in nature. The root will come out the pointy end. So there's a kind of a round flatted end of the acorn. The root comes out the pointy end. The first thing it does is it can sense gravity and it will grow straight down. So if you plant your acorn with the flat end down, the root will come out and then it's got to turn around and go all the way down as it's looking for the soil. You don't want that to happen. So plant it sideways and the root will grow straight down. After you've planted your acorn, cover the pot with leaves, not a thick layer, but what you're doing is it helps to maintain the soil moisture in your pot. You don't want it to dry out. Drying out over the wintertime is one of the things you need to worry about. Or even if you plant it in the spring, you don't want it to dry out. Remember, your pot is typically above ground, so it's exposed to sun and wind, and it can dry out that soil pretty well. So you don't want that to happen. The leaves will help prevent that from happening. Even once it's in a pot, you still have to worry about those acorn predators, particularly mice. They're really smart. They can figure out that there's something good to eat in that pot. They will climb up over and find your acorn, or there's holes in the bottom of pots. Sometimes they'll go right through the hole. If it's not big enough, they'll chew it till it's big enough and get in there and eat it from the bottom. So you have to be clever, more clever than the mouse. And sometimes that's hard to do, and protect the acorn. Now it's going to germinate. And you might say, well, okay, it's safe from those mice or squirrels. Not entirely, because they will actually pull it right out of the ground and eat the acorn that's still attached to this young tree. So it's not till a couple months after the acorn has germinated that it's actually safe from those acorn predators. Okay, it is best if you're going to have it in a flower pot. Now, if you put it in the ground straight away, it's out in nature, it's got full sun, and there's nothing to worry about. But if you have it in a flower pot, sometimes we tend to keep the pot in an area that's too shaded. And if it's too shaded, the leaves will grow up as if they're going to always be shaded. The cell structure of leaves that are shaded is different from the cell structure of leaves that are in full sun. So if you're going to take this pot eventually and plant it outside, and if you take it from shade to direct sun, you can kill all those leaves very quickly. So what you have to do is condition your pot. It is best to actually have your pot in full sun right from the start, so any leaves that come up are going to be, they're going to be full sun leaves. They'll be able to handle any place you plant them eventually. But if you don't do that, let's say you germinate it real early, you have it inside when it's cold, you're going to have to condition it by exposing it to sun slowly, maybe partial shade for a while, until those leaves build up the cell structure that they need to be in full sun. So this is about where you want your leaves to be when you're actually going to put your tree in the ground. These, I took this picture off the web. These are actually chlorotic. They don't have the proper nutrients. You want them to be a nice deep green. But it is safest to put the plant that you have started, especially if you started in a greenhouse or inside, plant it after the last frost date. Remember, if you had planted it outside to begin with, these leaves wouldn't be this big that early on in the season. So you want it to be after the last frost date before you put it out, and then it should be fine. But again, you've got to fight those things that want to eat those acorns. And in most parts of the country these days, deer are the major problems, not just for eating acorns, but for eating the young oak trees as well. They love young oaks. And after you spend the whole winter getting it through in the refrigerator and you get successful germination, you put it out, you don't want it to be eaten the very first day by deer, which means we've got to protect it. So I use cages, wire cages they're about 5 feet tall. You can get them at Home Depot or Lowe's, anywhere that sells wire like this, about galvanized wire mesh. Now this is wire mesh that I bought in the year 2000. So it's 22 years later, still good as new. I have used these cages over and over again at my house. Just after the plant gets big enough and it doesn't need to be caged anymore, I call it graduation, and I simply move the cage to another plant. But I have a lot of deer, and if I don't do that, I'm going to lose any of the plants that I want. A nice feature is that they blend into the background. So if you're in suburbia and you know, aesthetics count, we know we don't want our neighbors to think we're low-class citizens here, but it does blend into the background pretty nicely, and that's a good feature. How big you make your cage is important. You don't want the branches to bump up against the side of the cage, because they're going to grow faster than you think, and they're going to be misshapen. And once a branch is misshapen through growth, it's going to stay that way. So that cage is too small, in my opinion. I've seen cages even much smaller than that, and you know, the tree is all bundled up. It's one of the reasons I don't like tree tubes. It scrunches up the tree in a way that misshapens it for years and years and years. So this cage is better. This one's even better. I like to give the plant plenty of room so it can stretch out in all directions without touching the edge of the cage. So here's the tree. The deer cannot get over the edge there and eat that tree, although they certainly would want to do that. They would strip every leaf on that tree if they could. A lot of people worry about the grass when they're planting their acorns. Grass is competitive, but an acorn is a big seed and it sends down a big root, and it's competitive as well. It'll do fine in your lawn, but you don't want to encourage the grass. So what I do, rather than digging up the grass, which removes a lot of topsoil, it's also a lot of work, I just put a good layer of leaves. I make them oak leaves around your baby oak. There could be an acorn in there. You wouldn't even know it. These leaves are going to break down, returning nutrients to the soil, exactly the type of nutrients that young tree needs. And they also help inoculate the soil with the mycorrhizal fungal associations that tree is going to need as well. So this is the best kind of mulch. Put some leaves in your cage and it will suppress the grass growth and help your oak grow very well. A lot of people want to make volcano mulches as their tree grows. I just saw this and took it as an example where you know, it looks like a volcano around your tree. You see it commonly. We have known for decades that this is terrible horticulture. This is a great way to rot out the base of your tree and eventually kill it. So no volcano mulching. You want it to be flat on the ground. There's some other do's and don'ts here, especially don'ts. Don't plant in the middle of the summer. So for example, if you germinate your oak tree, but you go on a vacation, come back and it's mid-July, that's a bad time to plant that tree. It would be better in that case to hold the tree in your pot and plant it in the fall. maybe mid-September. Because it's very hot and very dry in the summertime. You'll have to really baby that if you plant it in midsummer by watering it and so on. The other big problem, and this happens all the time, is that people plant their trees too deep. What do I mean by that? Well, now we're not planting a big tree here, we're planting a tiny tree, but it's the same principle. People want to dig a big hole, a deep hole for their tree so that the roots can spread out. And most people think roots grow straight down. Most of the time, they're growing laterally. So digging a wide hole, that's great, but you don't want it to be deep because the tree will settle. This is the crown of the tree, and you don't want the crown of that tree to settle down below the soil level. So there's the crown of your little oak tree. You have to make sure that the hole you dig is not going to be so deep that it will settle down below this crown, because that can eventually kill the tree as well. It's the most common planting mistake people make, and also one of the most deadly. So, you've planted your tree. It's going to start to grow. It's small. And the first year oak seedlings put on 10 times more root biomass than they do above ground biomass. So you might be watching your oak and saying, well, gee, it's not doing much. It is doing a lot, but it's doing it mostly underground. But this is enjoying the process. That little tree is going to become a big tree in very short order, and it's going to start supporting the wildlife in your yard much more quickly than you think. There are hundreds of species of caterpillars that use oaks, and those caterpillars, of course, are what feed the birds, particularly when they're nesting. It takes thousands of caterpillars to make one nest of bird, and it really doesn't matter what species it is. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. And your tree will start to produce caterpillars right away. This is a pin oak at my house that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. That's a good thing. And people would say, oh, no, it's going to kill my tree. It's not going to kill your tree. Look, it's only eaten part of the leaves. Remember, the tree is putting on a lot of underground root biomass now. So what it's doing is contributing part of the energy that it's harnessed from the sun to this caterpillar. A bird's going to come eat that caterpillar. Your tree is part of the food web now, doing exactly what you want it to do. This is one of the reasons you planted your tree. So don't go squishing the caterpillar. Don't spray it. Just this is where we're going to let nature take its course. So yeah, where we want those caterpillars because they make the birds. Again, most of our birds are depending on the caterpillars, and we might as well plant a tree that's going to make the most caterpillars, and that would be an oak. And before long, your tree will look just like that. Not really. This is the angel oak in South Carolina. It is many hundreds of years old, but it shows you oaks can get large. Okay, I think that's it. So there you go. Half hour. Turn it over to you, Clark.
I'm back with
Yep.
you.
You're turning it over to me for some questions and answers.
Sorry. Okay.
That's okay. We have a couple of questions directly related first. So the first question is, could you overwinter the acorns in a screened-in porch or a garden shed?
Yes, but remember, it's not raining in your porch or your garden shed, so you're going to have to watch out for desiccation. That's a good point, because I right now have probably 30 pots in my garage that I have over winter. It's the easiest way to keep the mice out, but occasionally I have to water them. So it's something you can't just forget about them, because by the end of the winter they will have desiccated.
How often are you watering them then?
I look at I get my little finger down there and touch the soil. If it's damp, I don't water them, but if it starts to dry out, no more than once a month.
You talked about your trees graduating out of the cages. What year or approximate size are your trees when you remove the cages?
When the tree is tall enough that it's up above the level of the cage, and a deer that's reaching up cannot strip it of its leaves. So that's when it's fairly safe from deer herbivory. There's one other thing you have to think about that I didn't mention, and that is, we call it buck rubbing. So when you have a lot of deer, the bucks, of course, have antlers in the fall, and every fall they make new antlers. They're covered with skin. We call it velvet, and they have to rub that velvet off. So what they do is they go to a tree that has a nice diameter of an inch or so, and they just rub their antlers up and down that. And it strips the bark off the tree. So you don't want that to happen either. If after you've worked on your oak, and by the time it's that big, it's 4 or 5 years, that's a big investment. You don't want the buck to come and kill it. So what I do in that case is I've got some old plastic deer fencing, and I just put one circular wraparound of mesh around the tree, tie it very loosely, and then the buck won't rub it. But you have to watch out for that until you've got a pretty good diameter, 4 or 5 inches in diameter.
Okay. Next question. Can I gather acorns now in February, put them in the refrigerator, and then plant them later this spring?
No. Because the acorns that are left now are almost certainly not viable. Blue jays are seeking out acorns. A single blue jay can move 4,500 acorns in a fall. And what they do is they pick them up and weigh them. And if they don't weigh enough, it's a good signal that either an acorn weevil has eaten part of it or it wasn't viable to begin with. And then they discard it. So that acorn's laying there, and you come along a couple of months later, that's the acorn that's laying there. The jay has already said, "Now this acorn's no good." You can collect them now, but you're not going to get any germination now. It's way too late. That's why I said the time to go for acorns is shortly after they drop. Particularly if you have a mast year, we didn't talk about that, but acorn production is not equal every year. Some years oaks make a whole bunch of acorns. In Lynn County, you had a mast year this past year, so that was great. Next year, you're probably not going to have that many acorns. You'll go a couple years with far fewer acorns, and then another mast year. So when you have a mast year, there's a lot of acorns around. You can collect them more or less at your leisure. But otherwise, it's not going to be that many, and all those animals that need those acorns get them very quickly. So you want to be on hand. You got to compete with them.
So if the person that asked that is in Cedar Rapids or surrounding area, Clark went out last fall during our mast year and individually picked up all 4,000 of those acorns for you. You can come get some from us. Okay, well, next question.
Did the job of a single jay.
Yes. Did I see a stake on one of your young trees? Can you talk about when you stake the trees and when you should remove the stake?
Right. You did not see a stake on the tree. You saw a stake on the cage. I should have mentioned that. What I use is rebar. So you can get rebar in various lengths, but I usually get it in 16 foot and then cut it. It's not expensive. It lasts forever. But then you pound it into the ground, and that means the deer can't push your cage over. Just like those squirrels, deer are really smart too. And when they figure out, particularly if it's a hard winter and they've run out of other things to eat, they will try to push your cage over and eat the buds on your oak tree. They don't just eat the green leaves, they eat the buds and the stems, and it's called browsing. So you do want to stake your cages. Also, it keeps them from blowing over in case you have big wind. I use rebar. You can use any kind of stake you want, but it's got to be something that's fairly substantial. I don't put a stake right next to the tree. There's no way you can do that without interrupting the root system itself.
Okay. How far apart from other trees or other seeds should you plant these acorn seeds?
That is another good question. Well, you saw what happened when you had a big wind in Cedar Rapids. A lot of trees blew over, and they blew over. You had a really big wind. That's not a good example, but we're hearing about tree falls in cities all over the place. What happens is we plant our trees as specimen trees, which means they're isolated. They're not near any other tree, and they get nice and big and spread out. And then we get a lot of rain and a lot of wind, and over they go. And they go over because their root system has not been able to lock in with any other tree's root system and form a very stable matrix. So the new thinking is that we should plant our trees closer together than we used to, so close that when their roots grow out, they will interlock with each other and form a very stable matrix. And then when you get the big wind, they don't blow over. Now, if you get a tornado, they can snap off. There's nothing you can do to protect against that. But a typical straight line wind will not blow these things over when they're locked in the way they would be in a healthy forest. So we're talking about planting groves. They can be oak groves. You can have all the trees in your oak grove, and that could be as few as 2. 3 is probably a better number, planted 6 to 10 feet apart, so much closer than you would normally do. Then those roots will grow together, lock in, and it's not going to blow over on your house or your driveway or your car when it becomes a full-size tree. It will not be a prize-winning specimen tree either. So you're going to view these trees as a grove, a group. They're always going to be viewed together, and collectively they're quite beautiful. But they will be, competing a little bit for particularly light. So no single tree in a grove will be as spectacular as it could be isolated, but it's going to live longer. It's not going to blow over. So that's what I suggest: 6 to 10 feet apart. And let them interlock. And this is the time to do that. You can't do that with bigger trees because you want them to interlock their roots right from the very start.
So there was an additional question similar, dealing with an established oak grove where the oaks are pretty close together, asking if it would be better to leave them thick or thin them to enhance the canopy.
Yeah. I'd leave them. It's a judgment call, and it depends on how thick they are. But I would leave them.
All right. So I have another question here. I think it's important to stake down and bury the cages a bit. I've had squirrels dig around or knock over smaller cages and get to my acorns. Do you agree? Are
Yes.
your cages sitting right on the ground? Are you digging them in, or?
I'm inherently lazy. I like to do it as easily as possible. I think staking them in is the easiest thing to do, so that it's not easy. If your squirrels are hungry enough that they're actually going to tunnel underneath it, I've never seen that. I've seen it with groundhogs in my vegetable garden, but not with acorns. But if you think that's going to happen, then yeah, you can dig them in. That's just a lot more work.
We have a question about keeping the critters out. Would a little bag made out of mesh with shavings of soap tied on the tree keep the deer out? It's a common remedy around here.
Right. I've heard of that. I'll tell you, nothing's going to keep a hungry deer out. They will eat anything, even things they hate to eat, if they're starving. So a bag of soap's not going to help you in that case. But I have heard that it's a good deterrent. Will the deer just move to the other side of the tree? Not sure. For me, and then there's sprays you can buy, Deer Away and other things. The trouble is you have to go out and respray it every time it rains. Again, I'm too lazy for that. So I put up a cage and move it once. So that's at the end.
Doug, do you have a preference of red oaks over white oaks? Someone has a swamp white oak in their backyard and he's thinking he can plant from that.
Yeah, no, that's great. My preference is governed these days by the type of oak disease you have in your neighborhood. We've introduced oak wilt, we've introduced bacterial leaf scorch, and they're attacking the white oak group and the red oak group differently. So red oak or bacterial leaf scorch is very hard on the red oak group. It really clobbers pin oaks and is hard on red oaks and black oaks as well. And we have it right here on our property. So from that point of view, white oaks are more resistant to that, and I would favor them. I've heard both for oak wilt. I've heard both ways, that it prefers a white oak group or prefers the red oak group, or maybe it hits both groups equally. But that's what governs my decision. And you might say, well, gee, only plant white oaks if you have bacterial leaf scorch. I don't do that either, because what we need to do is discover the trees that have resistance to these diseases. In the West, we've got sudden oak death syndrome. All three together are killing millions of oak trees, and we've got to keep these trees in our forests. There is resistance to all of these diseases. So what we have to do is plant more oaks than ever, so that and many of them will sick and die, but the ones that don't are going to be the future of our oak forests. Those are the acorns that the jays will disperse, because the sick trees won't make acorns. It's going to be a transition of at least a full generation of oaks to get the resistance into our forests. But stopping, not planting the oak trees is not the way to go. We want to plant more than ever and just keep our fingers crossed.
Good. We have a few questions asking about transplanting opportunistic seedlings that have come up. So
Mhm.
I've got a couple seedlings in the garden or in the backyard. Is there yet any tips on transplanting those?
Yeah, if you know the history of those, so if you know that there wasn't a seedling there last year and it just came up this year, that's a great time to transplant it. But oak seedlings can come up and stay seedlings for 20 years. That seedling may be much older than you think, and it may have a substantial root system, which will make it hard to transplant, much harder than you think. So just because it's small doesn't mean it's particularly young. It's just been waiting for sun to hit it so that it can really take off. So if you really know that you've got a seedling from this year, that's a great time to transplant it. Try to get all the roots. If you don't, it's not the end of the world. They'll regrow them, but it will set it back a little bit. But don't be fooled if you take a 2-foot oak and say, oh, I'm just going to move that because it's this year's oak. It could be 20 years old.
Good. Here's one from Jess. In my home, I've had resistance with oak plantings because I've been told they are too messy. Do you have any tips for combating this? Is the acorn fall something to just accept about the oaks?
It's something to celebrate about the oaks. It's one of the biggest contributions they make is to produce acorns that support a number of species of birds, a number of species of other organisms. It helps get turkeys and black bears and all those birds through the winter, that wonderful package of food. All right, so I'm not convincing you about that, but yeah, you hear about the little old lady who cuts down her oak tree in her yard because she's tired of raking leaves. That should be against the law. I mean, these trees are providing essential ecosystem services for us, and we need them. They're not optional. So it's like going out to your street and cutting down the telephone pole because you don't like it. It's ugly and it has those ugly wires on it. Not allowed. We need those ugly wires for electricity. We need those trees as well. So it's better to educate whoever thinks it's terribly ugly that the leaves are important, the acorns are important, the trees themselves are critically important. They're holding tons of carbon, and we want to do everything we can to keep them around. Boy, I don't know. Yeah, I guess you can rake up your acorns and put them someplace else, and then people won't think they're messy, but
perhaps those neighbors in the future will thank you for the beautiful songbirds showing up in your neighborhood.
maybe, yeah.
A couple of questions about oaks and shade versus sun. One question is, most of the info I've found on oaks is that they want sun, but I have a treed ravine and I would like to incorporate some oaks. And also, are there understory oaks or shade oaks that I can add to existing areas?
You know, most plants like sun. There are plants that can tolerate shade, and so we talked about them as shade tolerant, but they're going to do most of their growing and blooming when they hit sun, and that's true for oaks as well. There are no oaks that prefer to be in shade over sun, but there are many oaks that do fine in shade. They just won't grow very fast. They're not going to reach the age where they produce acorns and catkins. But what they're doing is holding their place in the forest and waiting for one of the shade trees to fall over and then bathe them in sunlight, and then they will take off. The understory that we talk about, the shrub layer in a forest, is often comprised largely of canopy trees that are just young, waiting for their chance. So absolutely, you've got a ravine, get those oaks down there. They're going to grow really slowly, but they will hold the soil. They're going to grow that big root system. So they'll perform that role. They will make leaves. They'll fall to the ground. They'll support some of those caterpillars, but it's the trees in the sun that are going to do most of that job.
Related question about planting oaks in already established trees or tree lines. And are there any species that aren't compatible? Sometimes we hear about black walnut trees not playing nicely with other species. Are there trees to avoid when you're planting your oaks?
Oaks don't mind black walnuts, if that's what you're asking. It's really the ericaceous plants, your azaleas and rhododendrons, and a few other herbaceous things that don't like the walnuts. But oaks do well with other trees. I don't know of any interactions that would discourage oaks.
All right. For novices like me, is there a good website to go to that shows acorns by type? I picked up some last fall under a nice tree and I don't know the tree name.
Good question. I don't know. I'll bet there is somewhere, but I'd have to research it. Yeah, I don't know. There's a guy named Guy Sternberg who has written a lot about oaks. He's got a book just came out this year. Can't remember the name of it. It's something about trees. Look up Guy Sternberg,
Okay.
Sternberg, I believe. I bet that his books have pictures of acorns.
Good. Next question is, we have a few very large oaks on our property. One died about 7 years ago and we left it as habitat for critters. Do we have to worry about whatever it died from? Would that spread?
Oh, if it hasn't spread in 7 years, you're fine. If it's a disease, those diseases go quickly. So yeah, people often, if oak leaf scorch hits, it will hit all your trees at the same time. It's spread, the spores are spread by the wind, sometimes moved by insects. So really it would have reached your other trees by now. It probably died from some other reason. And thank you for leaving it. A dead oak tree is a very valuable resource there are 85 species of birds that are cavity nesters, tree hole nesters in this country. And oaks, they stand for so long that they can provide habitat for anything that lives in dead trees for a very long time.
In that same vein, does oak wilt transfer through the root system?
Yes, it can. It can. Roots will graft with each other. And yep, there's somebody who's thinking about diseases will say that's a good reason not to plant a grove, because those roots will intertwine, and if one gets sick, it'll make them all sick. So life's full of trade-offs. You can have it blow over and not get oak wilt, or stay together and not blow over but get oak wilt. Yeah, I don't know. There it is, the whole truth. It can transfer through root grafts, so an arborist might come in and say, we're going to put down a barrier between your roots to try to sever any connections. That might work. I know that there's people who will charge you a lot of money to go to very elaborate lengths to prevent your trees from dying once they're sick. It almost never works. So I think the best strategy is to plant a new oak and hope that it's resistant.
Next question. In the picture with the larger deer fence, the grass was dead. I assume that was because it had mulch on it before you took the picture, but could you explain why the grass appeared dead? Thanks.
No, I found that in my slides from shortly after I moved in. I'd noticed that too. I said, I don't remember killing that grass. But something killed the grass. You don't have to do that. And I thought of that when I put the picture up. I said, oh, nobody's going to notice that. But I was wrong. It's not necessary. You don't have to kill the grass. I don't remember if I had anything on it or not. So forget you saw that.
Okay. We're going to try to stump you with this one.
Well, that's easy.
Are you familiar with the edibility of acorns? Can non-viable acorns be eaten since they are not planted, or is there not much to consume in these non-viable acorns?
Well, I do know that acorns were a large, important part of Native American diets. And we had oak-dominated forests wherever there were forests across the country, except for the Rockies, where oaks don't really occur, except in Colorado where you have the Gamble oak. But the West Coast, again, Native Americans managed oak forests so they could get, it was good for game, and it also produced tons of acorns, which they then would gather up. They would put them in screen cages and sink them into streams and let the streams leach out the tannins of those acorns. They'd have them in there for months. They would leach the tannins out. Then they'd pound them up into a flour, and it was a staple of their diet. So yes, acorns are good to eat. I don't know. I suspect that a non-viable acorn is not going to be what you want to eat either. It's probably had something, if the acorn weevil's in there, it riddles it with holes, and that would allow bacteria and fungus to get in there. So I would stick with the viable ones if you're going to eat it. There was a woman in California who went to the trouble of collecting a lot of acorns and making oak flour for me. And she sent it to me. It was, I don't know, half a pound. And I actually made, Cindy made pancakes out of it. And they were great. They were great, but it was a tremendous amount of work for that poor woman to do this. So it is a good food source, but if we get to the stage where we have to eat acorn flour, things are not good.
Okay, could you talk a little bit about fertilizing? Should the seedlings be fertilized? Should the emerging trees be fertilized at any point in time?
That is a good question. I'm writing all these things down to add to the talk. No, don't fertilize your oaks. Oaks, particularly in the north, do not want high fertilizer. When the glaciers came down, they really leached the nutrients from our soils, and most of our North American plants, particularly up north, are adapted to low nitrogen soils. You can kill your oak by fertilizing it, because what that does is encourage growth so fast that the bark doesn't keep up and it splits the bark. I have done this. When I started, I thought, hey, fertilizer is better than no fertilizer. Not so. We've got to go with what these trees are adapted to, and they're, for the most part, adapted to low nutrient soils. That's why oaks do well in sandy areas. It's why they do well on rocky outcrops. They're very good at low nutrient soils. So don't spoil that by adding extra nutrients.
We could go on for probably another 40 minutes, but I'm going to do one last question, and then we will turn it back to Clark. So the last question is, what are your thoughts or suggestions for an undergrowth, like establishing native prairie, or what should we plant under these oaks, and when, at what stage?
Yeah, another great question. You in Iowa are in a transition zone, what we used to call oak savanna, where you had oaks, particularly the bur oak was very good at lower rainfall levels as you move further west. And between these oaks was prairie. That's oak savanna. It was a transition from the eastern deciduous forest to the treeless prairies of the farther west. And they were one of the richest ecosystems in North America. There is less than 1% of the oak savanna ecosystem left, but it's a very valuable ecosystem. And yes, prairie plants do well in that ecosystem. When we got rid of fire and when we got rid of the bison, everything started to replace those oak savannas. Trees came in. The fire used to keep them down, and you would have a much more open landscape. So the people say, well, oaks create acid soil. They don't. They do well. Some species do well in acid. Some species do well in basic soil. So you want to go with the soil type that you have, and the underplantings would be appropriate for that soil type too. But prairie plantings under your oaks are very appropriate.
All right, thanks, Doug. I'm turning the ending over to Clark.
Okay, Lisa, thank you. Well, there was one other question that I was asked that didn't come out. I'll throw it out because it's a common gardener practice, and that is soaking the seed overnight. Would you do that with an acorn?
No, no need to do that, because if you're planting it right away, it will get soaked normally from dew and rain and germinate when it's ready. It is your acorn is not, it will germinate when the timing is right, not whether or not it's been exposed to moisture. So a lot of our herbaceous plants, grasses and things, they're not germinating because they're dry, and as soon as you add moisture, they'll germinate. That's what that soaking is all about. But it's dormancy that's preventing the red oak group from germinating, not lack of moisture. So no, I wouldn't bother soaking them.
You talked in the fall about the leaf litter and letting it remain. And so if you do that, my neighbor has collected 20 garbage bags full of oak leaves because he's going to use it for fertilizer for other trees and so on. So help us out with that. Are oak leaves that good as far as a natural fertilizer for other trees, let alone the oak tree?
All leaves are good for fertilizer, but oak leaves break down more slowly. So they're providing that protective blanket over your soil community better and longer than other types of leaf litter. Other types of leaf litter break down very quickly and return the nutrients to the soil, but then you have bare soil.
And
So,
so
for
you,
maples or birches, you don't get through the year with that bare soil with them, but oak leaves will give you that protective leaf litter. Everything in the soil community requires high humidity, and that's what that leaf litter is doing. It's keeping the humidity and the moisture in the soil.
do people actually take the oak leaves and chop them and use them for basic mulch around their property?
They do, but when you chop up your leaves, you've chopped up all the little pupae and things that are in those leaves. So, some
You
of our
prefer not to chop them, but use them whole.
keep all the leaves that fall on your property, use them someplace. Yeah, I prefer not to chop them.
Well, I can hear the applause if you can't.
No, I can't, but that's okay.
You did an excellent job. And of course, what this is it's a setup for the spring, but even a bigger setup for the fall. Because we have people on this call that are going to go, yeah, Clark picked those off my ground. I want some of these and some of these and some of these. And so, yes, we'll be picking up acorns, and we'll have more than a single variety ourselves. And so what you're doing here is, it's a first step, and hopefully you're successful. But golly, if you're not successful, comes around again in the fall. And of course, the white acorns, start popping their roots out the side of the acorn if they're laying on the ground for 3 or 4 days. So those you can go right to town on in the fall. So we hope this is kind of an ongoing thing for the people on the call, that they just carry this over, hopefully talk to their neighbors about doing the same thing. There's no reason not to. This is just helping the environment. And of course, I got ready this morning for next week. This is my protection. And I don't have deer where I'm planting my oak next week. So I won't probably use a re-rod or a steel stake on this. I'll probably stake it down with something lesser because I don't have deer. But the trick is, of course, to keep it surrounded and yet let all the air go through it and the sun. So that should last me 1.5 years, shouldn't it?
That's going to last you decades.
Well, that's for the other acorns. Doug,
Right.
I want to thank you very much. I want to remind the people on this call, there are 4,555 acorns. Don't let Mary and Clark down on this. We want them in the ground. And so let's get your neighbors and other people going on this. They're located at our partner sites, Indian Creek Nature Center. We'll have them available during normal hours. WikiUp, the same thing, and Monarch Research. So come on out. The acorns are already distributed to those 3 locations, and they're ready to go. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It was just great, Doug. I mean, I've been kind of working on this for a long time, trying to understand everything I could. I learned more in your 30-minute presentation than I picked up in the last, 5 weeks of working and looking at acorns. So thank you very much. And we'll talk soon about fall and what we might want to do to give a little injection in the fall of more information to Lynn County residents. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.